Okay, let me introduce myself. Julian Williams. I've been involved in trying to develop and promote social theory in the School of Education for quite a few years now. I'm technically a professor of maths education, but a lot of this work is about theory and applies across educational research in general. And I've been working with social theory such as Etienne's, and also activity theory in writing about maths education and writing theoretically for some years. And today is a special event. We've got Etienne here prior to the beginning of the social learning theory course that we run. So the general idea is I will introduce Etienne academically in a minute. We will have about an hour and a quarter talking with Etienne. I should say, this is the fourth occasion on which I've made a presentation without PowerPoint. I really feel I'm coming off the drugs now. Feel every sympathy with David, who's given up smoking, and we're marching in tune. Every month that he keeps off cigs, I'm keeping off PowerPoint. And I refer you to my friend Edward Tufte, who was the first real scientist of envisaging information, who's got a website which is full of anti-PowerPoint material, where he says that PowerPoint was responsible for the Challenger disaster, not the O-rings. You heard that one before?
No, I'm ready to believe that.
And I mean, just have to say that having seen Etienne with his 67 PowerPoint presentations before, he has a unique way of ignoring all of them and saying what he wants to say anyway. So it's a different way of using PowerPoint, which I could get used to, I think. Welcome to the day. We're going to have an hour and a quarter-ish talking about social theory with Etienne, in his usual discursive style. Interrupt and ask a question, tell him he's wrong again, etc. at the appropriate moment. And then we're going to talk, for those of you that are here seriously to find out more about the course, about how we run this course. I like to think of it in Bakhtin's terms of it being a dialogical course. Students study in small groups. We come together in meetings like this and share what we've learned, and argue and bicker sometimes. Etienne says that we're like an old married couple. Oh, there's another point, but I'll get to that later maybe. Etienne's an old married couple. He's been married 3 months now.
A week.
A week? Only a week?
Yeah.
Really? But I keep saying it's for the third time, so... So really, he's way ahead of me.
I'm ahead of you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I've only had one, technically. Technically. Yeah. Okay. So Etienne's going to talk about learning and living through landscapes of practice. But I just want to say a couple of things first, because I think Etienne is bringing us more up to date with this theory, and it may be that some people who've come here are thinking, yeah, well, what about his book on communities of practice, and what about situated learning before that? So just say a few words. The book by Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger called Situated Learning places all learning in a social context and suggests that knowledge is related to practice, social practice being the fundamental concept here, I think, and the fundamental concept of sociology since Marx. So one doesn't have knowledge which one transfers. All knowledge is situated in practice, and the attempt to transfer knowledge is thereby always problematic. I first came across this with Jean Lave writing about the arithmetic of grocery shopping. And it's still a wonderful little paper, short paper in a compilation by Chaplin and Lave. Yeah, both of them.
I thought she had a book about it.
That the arithmetic that grocery shoppers use is very much mediated. This is an important notion of theories of social practice, mediated by the tools, by the structure of the building, if you like, all those sorts of things, by one's intentions, one's needs, by history, etc. So situated learning provides maybe half a dozen case studies showing how in many different informal situations this is important to understanding how learning really works. And the concept of identity, which is particularly developed much more in the 1998 book, brings to the fore questions about motivation, why should I be doing this, why am I here, within that context, that people are learning and living at the same time. What Jean Lave and Etienne don't write about is formal academic learning, very much. The first time Jean Lave spoke in this university is maybe 10 years before you arrived, actually. She was here on a sabbatical, and in answer to a question about schools, she said, well, me and my friends don't like schools very much. But actually, if you think about it, school learning is also very, very much situated. And we who work in education sometimes privilege schools and universities and academic institutions as places of learning rather than informal learning in ways that are very dangerous to learning. And indeed, even the concept of what mathematics is, or of what French language or history is, and so on, is institutionalized and shaped by the institutions of academic education in very particular ways, if you think about it, often in very dangerous ways. I think these are some of the concepts then that bring us up to 1998, where Etienne's book on community practice really became famous, and people all over the world want to know, how do you make a community practice work, particularly how do you make it profitable if you're working in industry, or how do you make it meet health service targets if you're working in the health service, and so on. But since then, after all 13 years of engaging in practice, Etienne's thought has moved on, and some things have become less important, some concepts have become more important, and I think that's where Etienne takes up today. So I look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Very good. So, one thing I can tell you is that when we meet for the course, we do not meet in dark rows. I do not like this format, but I was unable to convince the team to quickly move the tables again. So, just to tell you that the course takes place really as a conversation, and the idea of the course really is that we were having conversations across certain strands of social theories of learning, and we thought, wow, these conversations are actually interesting. Why don't we create a course where the students can be invited into our own conversation? So it's not so much a taught course as it is an invitation into conversations we are having about the meaning of those theories and how they can be used. So what I'm going to try to do today is not so much give you a formal introduction to the theory as to try to give you a sense of what does it mean to take a social theoretical perspective on learning. And so I'm going to do this with some stories and some perspective. You should feel free to interrupt with questions. Actually, you're not interrupting. That's what I mean. We should feel free to do this conversationally. I always prefer to talk about this in a conversational mode. I've given this talk many times. The people who are sitting here who have been through this before will be terribly bored if they hear the same talk again. So 10 points to the first person who says something. Okay. Good. And I think I'm going to start. I was hesitant to do that because there are some people here who have heard this story 300 times. So it's always embarrassing to let people know that you don't have that many stories under your sleeve. But I'm going to tell you my wine story once more because I still believe it's an easy way into the thinking. And Yeah, I was working with Jill Lev in an institute called the Institute for Research on Learning. That was an institute that was actually started outside of the university by the Xerox Foundation in response to a report by the Department of Education in the US. It was A Nation at Risk, the title of it. You don't have to read the report to know what the report was saying. When the Department of Education puts out a report that says A Nation at Risk, you know what they're saying about the state of education in the US. And the idea of that institute was, why not we create a context where a bunch of scholars can come together and rethink our assumptions about learning. There was a really beautiful invitation. I was still a graduate student at the time working on my dissertation, and I was invited to join that institute. And it was very interesting. Actually, some of the inspiration for the format of the course was because in that institute there were people like Jean Lev and Bill Clancy and you know, people that to me were really kind of gods in the Parthenon of thinking, and they were going at each other's throats because basically when you had computer scientists for whom learning is a matter of information processing, right? So for a computer scientist doing cognitive modeling, your idea of a learner is that a learner is an information processor. You give that learner the proper data, and that learner will construct the knowledge structure that will account for that data. And you know, we were fairly successful. That's the field I was coming from. We were fairly successful at modeling little things like student subtraction behavior, you know, and we could look at, we had little programs that could look at 10 subtraction problems by a student and say, this student, because normally, you know, the result is 5 wrong and 5 right, and the program was able to say, this student does not know how to borrow across zeros. So these are the kind of things that we were doing. You had anthropologists also invited into the discourse. So it was multidisciplinary. That's why we, at that time, studied institute outside of a university for people to engage across disciplines. And you had anthropologists who were saying, you know, this is not really what matters about learning. What matters about learning is how people engage with the world and make meaning. And to me, that was really attractive, because coming from computer science, I knew that we were very good at dealing with information structures, but we were very bad at dealing with issues of meaning. Because, you know, the problem, if you're a computer, is that you can send people their paycheck, but you hope that what you're sending them has meaning to them, because to you, it's just ones and zeros. See what I mean? So that model of the learner can deal with information, but has a lot of trouble dealing with questions of meaning. And I had this kind of intuition that meaning is really very important about when you talk about human learning. So this is kind of like where I was coming from. And so that's where my little wine story actually comes in, because it was an experience that I had at that time that kind of clicked for me. Yeah, this is really what we're trying to do. This is really what we're trying to capture with our theory. And let me tell you the small anecdote of an evening where I was invited at a friend's house and served a glass of wine. And that friend asks me, "What do you think?" And because I'm not a wine connoisseur at all, you know, I find that cheap wines taste better than expensive wines, so there's something wrong with me. I just very politely said, "It's pretty good." And my friend kind of like, "No, this is a very good bottle." So to honor me that evening, he had served me a very good bottle of his best wine. And I must have looked kind of surprised, because he went on to tell me why it was a very good bottle. And this is when, to me, a new universe opened up. A universe where there is strawberry along this side and there was chocolate somewhere else. I don't remember exactly, but I remember enough to tell you that it was a different universe. You know, there was, I think, a strong entrance and a long lingering, and so on and so forth. There may be some oak somewhere. There's always some oak somewhere in a wine. I don't remember where the oak was, but but at some point that guy goes into this kind of trance state above his glass and goes like, and this one has a really good purple in the nose. And this purple in the nose expression has become emblematic for me, because it was like, yes, this is what we're trying to capture with this theory. Because this notion purple in the nose was unimaginable for me. See, I can imagine, I could not taste the strawberry up there. But the idea that a wine would have purple in the nose was beyond my ability to comprehend, you know. The joke is, and I did have that thought that evening, that people who drink a lot of wine tend to have a purple nose, you know. But I was too polite to say that, because I knew that's not what he meant. I knew he meant something much more esoteric. And actually, I did not know how esoteric that was at the time, because by using that story all the time, people come and talk to me, and I have learned that the nose he was talking about was actually not the nose of the person, it was the nose of the wine. You know, apparently, for those of you who know that, the wine has a nose somewhere above the glass. I don't know exactly where it is, but there is something that's called the nose of the wine. And the purple that he was talking about, I thought purple, it was red wine, you know, it looked purple, but it was not. White wine can have purple in it, because purple has nothing to do with the color of the wine. Purple has to do with berries and something like that. Okay, so still not understand exactly what it is. But and you know, what was interesting about that experience as I was working with Jane on the theories is like, a human practice is the construction of a universe. And if you are not an inhabitant of that universe, you may hear the words, but you have absolutely no access to the meaning. And the meaning is a certain experience of a glass of wine. So the meaning is not a dictionary kind of meaning. You see what I mean? The meaning is, the sentence is almost like a set of instruction. Purple in the nose. So you put your nose on the nose of the wine and experience purple. See what I mean? So it's interesting how the words are in fact almost like a signpost to a certain way of experiencing the world. But it's a way of experiencing the world that is very much related to a social practice, because what I realized after that is that my friend is actually a member of a club, of a wine taster club. And so these people have developed, in relationship to a lot of other clubs like that, certain ways of talking about the wine. So he was not inventing this language in front of me. He was kind of inviting me into the practice of his community, saying this is the way we look at wine, you know. And so he was giving me a window into a human practice, but it's a human practice that in fact gave us, and we were across the table, I realized in this table between us is a boundary of practice. And it's invisible, but we have very, very different experience of that same wine, because I don't belong to that community and he belongs to that community. And to me this is like, okay, now I'm starting to understand what's missing in our computer models. See, what's missing in our computer models is not so much more computational power, you know, because some people tell you, you know, if we could have 10 billion microprocessors, we will be able to reproduce human intelligence. You know? And no, that's not what's missing. What's missing is that the poor computer does not have membership in any human practices, and so it's not a problem of increasing the computational power. Maybe if you play Jeopardy or if you play chess, you know, so computers become very good at playing chess, because you don't need to have access to a lot of meaning. You have access to the rules, and you become very good at following the rules, right? But then I became more and more interested in a social theory of meaning, or of learning, because I realized that the meaning of that's purple in the nose is a matter of social participation, and not a matter of accessing another piece of data in my brain. And if you look at it, from a learning practice perspective, if I had wanted to learn about that expression purple in the nose, I would have to have been accepted into that meeting that they have once a month and join them drinking wine. And over time, I would be able to say for myself, if I had drunk enough wine myself, in the company of people who know the practice, I would be able to say for myself, yes, this class has a good purple, or this class does not have a good purple. See what I mean? And slowly I would have, yeah.
I don't know whether I ever told you, because I have heard this story 3 or 4 times before.
Yeah.
But the wine tasting metaphor is used by people who do classroom evaluation or educational evaluation. That they say, getting used to understanding what is a good lesson or what feels good in terms of a practice of teaching and learning is a process of prolonged exposure to good teaching and learning, and that's the only way you can do it. And so they use the wine tasting metaphor.
I didn't know that.
I forget the name of the guy who originally came up with it, but it's there in the literature. So that it's and even inventing terms like, well, this one was purple in the nose. You had a real feeling that these kids were engaged or something that would communicate your sense of experience with other people doing the same job elsewhere. So it's writing about the wine tasting experience or the classroom experience.
But it becomes very embodied, right? It becomes very embodied as an experience as a meaningful experience of engaging in the world, And so, from a social perspective, what we have here, if you want to talk about learning theory, is that we have a competence that has been defined by a community. And then my experience of the glass of wine. And if over time I had engaged with that community, my experience of the glass of wine would have fit within the competence. You see what I mean? Because I could have tried to fake it. It's an interesting question from a learning perspective. What would have happened that evening if I had been very kind of shy or something, and I said, no, you're right. It's a really good purple in the nose, right? How long would it take for this community to catch me? You see? And say, you are faking knowledgeability here, And if it is a good community, I think it would be a good sign if they caught me. You see? It would be a sign that they have some depth, That it is not that easy to fake, So you can think of, if you think of the world of knowledge, you can think of this community having kind of colonized a little hill, And you need to climb that hill to become fully competent, And of course, on that hill, there are obstacles, and there are people who say, no, you can't climb anymore. You are not fit for climbing. You see what I mean? So it's a very social way of understanding learning, but not that the competence is predefined. You see? Because the competence is still subject to contestation, Like, for instance, one day, somebody must have come into this community and brought this notion of a purple in the nose, and you can imagine that maybe the community didn't accept it at first. You see what I mean? It's like you, if you are doing your dissertation, right? You are entering a community, you want to be a member of that community. There are people like Julian who sit on top of that hill and watch you climb, and they say, yeah, you are climbing properly, and they give you a PhD, and you're gonna have to contribute to that community, but they want you to do literature search first, because they want you to demonstrate that you have honored the learning of that community. In some sense, the community has a learning history, and before you can contribute to it, you have to demonstrate that you have, even if you disagree, even if you propose something new, you have to demonstrate that you have honored the history of learning of that community. And then you are invited to contribute something. And, for me, I tell you, if I read a dissertation, sometimes I'm on a dissertation committee, my criterion is always, does this person understand what this community has been trying to do? And are they telling me something that is new to me? You see? Are they?
I've got a question.
Yeah?
As I understand, there is a big tension in the theory, not in the theory, but actually the concept of community practice, between on the one hand preserving knowledge which is already there, reproducing it, and on the other hand the normal tendency of humans to innovate. So innovation or stagnation, where's the answer here? So is stagnation more typical in communities of practice, or are they innovative, or are they both?
Think of a community of practice as an unstable equilibrium between different claims to competence. Right? So learning is from this perspective, learning is a claim to competence. Okay? So I go to Julian with my dissertation and I say, I claim competence in this community. And this is the reason why. Okay? A claim to competence can be, I've learned the history of this community and I know the literature. The claim to competence could be, I challenge your community. I challenge what you've said, And so, whether you are bringing something new or whether you are adopting the history, they are both claims to competence that has to be negotiated, you see? So think of a community as a kind of social system where various experiences of different human beings kind of claim the competence. So it's a very kind of micro-political view of learning, because it is really a view of learning that does not distinguish between power and learning. You see, learning is always a claim to competence and a claim to powerfulness, if you will. Okay. Now, you can imagine that the old guard has a stake in the history of a practice and maybe will resist some people, and justifiably so, by the way. Because some people say, oh yeah, your theory is conservative, Communities of practice always resist innovation. Well, they have a history of learning to honor. And that is a good thing. See, you don't want to go to a professor with some newfangled little idea, right, that you thought of last night, and the professor says, oh, that's great, we are very liberal in this university, whatever goes, we are innovative. No, you want to say, listen, this is old hat, we already know, we've studied that for 30 years, and we already know that this is, you have to give me a better argument, So I don't think that communities are inherently stagnant or inherently innovative. But if you start thinking about it as a micropolitics of learning between different claims to competence, you can say that they are very vulnerable to the old guard kind of like holding onto their turf, They are vulnerable to people being bored, So, but practice is not stable. So it's not a theory that assumes structure that needs to be changed. It's not a theory that has to explain change. It's a theory of unstable social equilibrium, right? Does it address what you were trying to say?
It's very relevant, really, and it just gave me some thoughts for my discussion. Thank you very much. Because in the business school environment, especially after your 2002 book, it's a general idea, kind of by default, to view communities of practice as extremely innovative and being used as a tool to foster innovation, to boost innovation. Although you write in your book that there are many diseases of communities of practice, very often they're dysfunctional, and they cause not only leakiness of knowledge, but also stickiness of knowledge.
Yes, yeah.
But generally, especially in the, let's say, consultancy-related management literature, it's all like black and white. Use of practice are great.
Yeah. Okay. So, for those of you who are new to the theory, you must understand that this started as a theory. We were trying to give language to things we were observing in the world. It has now evolved, and some people have taken a more instrumental view of it, you know. So, at first, it was an analytical concept to talk about what we are observing in the world. Now, some people say, okay, these communities must be good. I would like to order 6 of them, you know, and how much is it going to cost? And can I have them in 3 months, you know? Because, you know, if you're running a business, and you know that knowledge and learning is important to your success, then communities of practice can be an interesting way to think about learning. You know, 20 years ago, if you talked about learning in a business context, people thought training department. You know. So the concept, and well, the people in HR would think training department. The people in the IT department would think database, knowledge bases. So there was a field of knowledge management that was proposing to use knowledge bases, large Lotus Node databases, to capture the knowledge of an organization and manage it that way. That was the state of the art in the 80s when these theories came. And so I remember giving talks about communities of practice and people feeling like liberated. You know, people like come to hug me after the talk because they say, finally, someone talks about knowledge as existing in the social fabric of the organization. And not only that, now I can start conceptualizing how my organization knows how it knows, that it has these informal, self-organized communities that are not necessarily visible, but where the knowledge is being negotiated as a social competence. You see? But of course, if you're a manager, you're not going to stop there, because you're not just someone who analyzes. You say, I want to help my organization learn and know better what it knows. Oh, so I could foster those communities. I could support them. I could give them a voice in the organization. So this is how the concept started to become instrumental from first being analytical. And I think that's what you are referring to. So, because of that, the concept has taken a kind of romantic dimension, that people think, oh, a community of practice is always a good thing. In the theory, the community of practice is very, very neutral with respect to good or bad. But it's a bit like the word learning. You see, the word learning has a very good reputation, right? Learning is good, right? Right? But it's a lot easier to say my cousin is learning the piano than to say my cousin is learning a life of crime on the street. It's both learning, you know? But you see what I mean? So even learning, in fact, is not a positive term inherently. Okay? So yes, communities of practice can be terrible, you know? A dysfunctional family is a very well-functioning community of practice, where everybody's entangled in the practice, their identity is completely entangled into it, and there's no way out, you know? So there are dysfunctionalities in communities, just like there are dysfunctionalities in any human structure, you know? There's nothing privileged about a community of practice as a social structure. But then it allows you to start asking questions, you know? So if a community of practice seems to be resistant to do new contribution, start thinking, okay, what are the structures within the community, outside of the community, that make this community defensive to new input? Who has a stake, and why in that history that they want to? And see, for me, again, you know, I want a community to honor its history, you see. There's something that you want, you know. Now, it may be that people have placed stakes in aspects of that history that can become counterproductive, but counterproductive for whom? In whose eyes, you know? I mean, innovation for what? For whom? You know? Is innovation always good? You see, again, they have this kind of like, once you take a real social perspective, you have a much more nuanced view of these questions. You know? So, to come back to analyzing this little wine event, another thing that I experienced that evening that I think was also telling about what we were trying to capture with that theory was that I found that very beautiful, this ability to describe wine in that way. And I was tempted to ask my friend, could I come on Thursday to your meeting, you know, and be able to talk like this. So because it was a very beautiful, to me, to my eyes, way of thinking about wine, you know. But I needed to ask myself, should I go there or not? You see? And so I had to reflect on my own trajectory, on who I am becoming. And actually, I remember that evening, kind of feeling a bit of temptation, and then decided, no, I'll just drink beer, because because I don't have time. You see what I mean? It doesn't. The sense of person that I have developed over the years, there's too much to do to finish that. That I'm not going to spend, because I realize it would take time. You know, if learning is a transformation of your experience of life, it's going to take time. It's going to require investment. It's not just a piece of information that you get out of Wikipedia. So I decided not to do it, and I think that's another really important aspect of the theory is this notion of identity. Is that what gave me a filter for deciding whether to go for that or not was the project of constructing who I am. Okay. Now the project of constructing who I am is a bit tricky because it looks like we can just make decisions however we want, and it is not the case, right? So it may very well be that this club would have refused me to start with, you know. Well, in this case, I'm a white, middle-aged guy, so they probably would have accepted me. But there could be all sorts of reasons why. So it's not like we construct our identity kind of willy-nilly how we want. We negotiate that landscape. There are hills, you know. There are hills that are hard to climb. There are hills that are not allowed for certain kind of people for reasons that have nothing to do with the practice of that hill. So it is really a social perspective on knowledge. But if you start imagining this as a landscape of different practices, you know, then you can see learning as this kind of journey where we belong to some hills. Of course, the problem is that we can belong to many hills at once, which is where the analogy breaks down. But this idea that the territory for our learning is already colonized by communities that claim a hill. See what I mean? I think it's a very important idea. But that doesn't mean that everything is predetermined. It's just colonized, you know? And you can contest. And actually, in your dissertation, you will have to some degree contest the structure of that hill or create a little mole somewhere on top of that hill and say, this is my mole. And if you want to climb, this is the conditions, and so on and so forth. You can think that some hills are really, really steep. Some are less steep. You know, I always give the example of my cousin, who is a particle physicist, who told me there are 10 people in the world who understand what I'm doing. That's a very, very steep hill. You know, if you are at that level of cultivating a little piece of knowledge in the world that is so narrow and so steep, you know. So think about the social landscape of learning, of knowing, as already being colonized by communities, and think of you as traversing that system. So if we now move to PowerPoint, sorry about that, but I think sometimes it's good to have visuals for people to remember, you know. So I was saying we started with this focus on meaning. So for me, what was really interesting about the purple in the nose is how does that become meaningful And you can say that it becomes meaningful in part because it's related to an experience of drinking. Okay, so it's meaning as experience, not meaning as definition. But it's related to a practice. So this expression, purple in the nose, belongs to a specific human practice, which is the practice of being a wine taster. That practice belongs to a community. That community, as I was saying, has all the complexity of a human system, where learning and status and power are part of the same cluster of processes. And then, of course, one's identity in relationship to that community. So for me, I can admit in front of you that I still, after using this story probably 500 times or something, do not know what purple in the nose means. Really. To me, it means something. I've yanked that story, I've re-embedded it into my practice with a completely different meaning. But the meaning in that community, because I have not entered that community, the meaning of that community I still do not know. And I am not embarrassed because my identity is not invested in that community. You know? When people tell me, do you know what a habitus is? And I'm not so sure. I'm much more like I have an identity crisis. Oh my God. You know, I should know that if I want to claim to be a learning theorist and I'm not so sure, you know, all of a sudden, you know, and I mean, you play that game all the time in the academy, you know. Have you read Bernstein's da 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 da? And it's like, you decompose, and, you know, because you're not so sure. So you can see how identity, learning, community become part of this notion of learning as a claim to competence, you know. Suddenly, you question my claim to competence. And it's like, I disintegrate. Instead of saying, I don't care, you know, I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academician, you know. That's your problem, not mine, you know. So this notion of identity is very, very important because it gives you an accountability to certain places of knowledge in the landscape and not to others. And you are kind of like, you have to modulate that, you know. So identity, but also identification then becomes very important. How much, you know, if you tell me you don't understand the habitus really, Etienne, you know, how much do I take that in as you're talking about me? You see what I mean? I can say, I don't care, I'm not a Bourdieu specialist. Or I can say, tell me more. Or I can say, and I will talk to you again. You know what I mean? And all that has to do with how we construct who we are becoming. So this is a very embodied, it's in this sense I think that it is mostly situated. The problem with what you were saying about transferring, right, is that people think of situated as a physical situation often. And it's not so much, I think, it's situated in the landscape in which we are building trajectories. So that is, to me, where it's very situated. And from that perspective, actually, the whole notion of transfer turns on its head. You know, because if you ask the question of transfer from the perspective of this theory, and I think it's a misunderstanding to think there is no transfer. But from the perspective of this theory, what you would say is we are transferring all the time because we are constantly moving from context to context, from practice to practice, and we cannot turn off who we are. If you completely turn off who you are when you move from one class to another, you have multiple personality disorders. That's pathological. You see? So our identity is multiply constituted, and of course it's more salient, you know, in certain contexts than in others. So it's more salient now that I'm engaging in that part of me that has to do with learning theory. But I've not forgotten and turned off the part of me that deals with consulting in companies, or the part of me that deals with my 14-year-old, who is still with me, even though I'm many miles away. You know? So we're constantly kind of being who we are in multiple ways. Right? But then why doesn't school knowledge transfer to other places? The beginning of an explanation from the point of view of this theory, which I think is actually an interesting thing to think about, is if you are put in a context where only a very thin slice of your identity is expressible, like a classroom. You know? Very little bit of you is expressible. Then no wonder what's happening there does not seem to transfer very much, because it's only a small part of you that's allowed to exist in that learning context. So it's a different way of thinking of transfer, I think.
Do you think that in the work environment, a bigger part of us is participating? I think it's also very, very limited.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, there are studies of innovation, talking about innovation, by Susan Justison at the business school in Denmark, who says exactly that. She says basically the innovativeness, the innovative characteristic of a team is very much can be predicted by the level of expressibility of a bigger part of their identity on the part of the members. She looked at they were not communities of practice, they were really innovative teams that were put together to innovate on a certain product. And she said one of the predictor of the innovativeness of that team is how much of who they are is expressible in that context. So they were dealing with yogurt, for instance, and how much of you as a parent is expressible in that context helped predict the innovativeness of the team. You know?
What's the name of the author?
Justesen, Gustesen, Susan. So, I think that what I'm, and I'm going to have to stop soon, but what I'm trying to do here is to give you a sense that if you take a certain perspective, a certain theoretical perspective, it does give you a different way of looking at the world. So if you take when I was in cognitive science, the question of transfer was a very important question, and it was viewed as a cognitive problem of finding generalities across context, you know, and this is how we were talking about, do students generalize when they conceptually generalize so that they can reapply the concept in a new context? So that's one explanation. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's an explanation. If you take a social perspective, you have different tools to explain, which have to do with expressibility and reconstituting yourself in different contexts. Yeah?
I'm really interested in what you were saying about the extent to which we can express our identity. And I wondered if there was any empirical evidence about different organisational forms like communities of practice or networks or whatever, about where are the places that people are more likely to express more of their identity. Is it in the community of practice with shared repertoires, or is it in a more loosely knit association?
I don't know. Actually, this notion of expressibility, which is becoming now a core concept of the theory, has not been studied very much. Okay, and it's paired with accountability. So accountability and expressibility are so you want to see kind of how do the two conflict with each other, serve each other, you know? So, you know, like expressibility is not a good in and of itself, right? So if you are on a military team, right, and you are accountable to winning this little battle, you don't have time to express like, oh, I'm missing my girlfriend or something. See what I mean? It's like, it's an terrible extreme example. I should not have used that. I regret it, but what I'm saying is that you know, sometimes on a team you are so accountable to a result that there is really no time to express anything else, right? In a community, the reason expressibility does not always function well is not so much because of the task, because a community of practice often does not have a specific task that focuses everybody. It's more like membership, you know? It's like, are you truly a member here, you know? Are you truly an academic, you know? Oh, you express an interest in business, maybe you're not really an academic, or people will question your membership if you start including other things. So different types of structure will put different pressure in that tension between accountability to what is happening there and expressibility, because this is not the only place where you belong. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And you find that certain communities take a very different approach to that. You know, I've seen communities where, for them to feel they can learn from each other, they had established a practice of sharing everything that happens in their life. You know, and it's actually I have a very specific example of a community that I visited, where they meet once a quarter, and for the first 4 hours of that meeting, they tell everything that has happened to them in their life, because they feel it gives a kind of context of trust, so that they can actually move to the business with their organization designers, so they can move to the business of sharing their professional experience. So they have decided as a community to allow this moment of full expressibility, because it serves as a container for the kind of intimate learning that they want to do in the professional realm. You know, so that's a design. They were intentionally designing that. They didn't have the terms that I'm using. It was an intuition, but in fact that's what they were doing. They were allowing a moment of full expressibility to then serve the accountability that they felt they had to learning together about how to run change programs in organization, which is a very emotional, emotion-laden thing to do. You know. So that's. I wouldn't say one is better than the other. Okay, so a basic idea of the kind of conceptual tools that a social theory deals with, and then you know, this idea that a body of knowledge is a curriculum which is often used in a university, and for me I would talk about the body of knowledge of a profession like teaching more as a kind of landscape of practices, you know. And in fact the learning of becoming a teacher is to find your location, to find a productive identity in that landscape where you have different practices, you know. You would have people who are doing research, you would have people who are doing regulations, you would have people who are doing teaching, teacher education, all of whom hope that they will have some effect on the moment of practice when you are with a student. You see what I mean? And in some sense, from this perspective, you would say that a professional is the representative of a landscape of practice, a complex landscape of practice, who has to translate the claims to competence in that complex landscape of practice into a moment of competence in the service of a student, or in the service of a patient, or in the service of a customer. You see what I'm saying? It's a bit of a different view of saying you need to acquire the body of knowledge of this community. You know, like we need to translate teaching or nursing or social services or management into a course. You know, we will put that course into your head, and then manifesting learning is to apply that course. You know, that's a certain view. It's a more cognitive view of learning, and again, it's not that those two views are incompatible. I think there are cognitive aspects to learning. Certainly, we have a brain, and we do have information structures. You know, but this is a perspective that would say, you know, we have to help our students develop a productive way of being within a complex landscape where there are different claims to competence, sometimes that work with that together, sometimes boundaries that are in conflict. You know, so if you are a nurse and you have to decide, am I going to give this person this shot, or am I going to give this person that test? You have to resolve for that moment. The research that says, oh, you don't know if this is any good. The regulations that says you have to give this test. The CEO that says we have to save money. See what I mean? So there is that dance of living in that complex landscape of practice that you have to resolve in moments of productive engagement in the world. You know? And it's a certain way of talking about the knowledgeability of a professional is that you have to experience the landscape as your identity and construct who you are in that moment. You know? So it's a different view of knowledgeability than to think you have certain pieces of knowledge in your head and you apply them in that moment. You know, and I think one of the reasons why it's actually an important perspective today is that from this perspective, if you think about knowledgeability as a state of the person that learning should lead to, I think that a trend that we see in the world is, and I'm going to show you the slides to just make that more memorable. So this is the idea that, in fact, there are lots of boundaries. You see, somebody was asking me, so why is community of practice such an important concept? And I think it's because in order to situate learning in the world, I need to have a geography of competence, you see. And I need to see that there are small pockets because I want to be able to be aware of the boundaries that exists, you know. So if you tell me, oh, the University of Manchester, to me it's not refined enough in terms of geography because there are lots of little practices that constitute the University of Manchester. So for me, to think the University of Manchester is a community of practice is not a very interesting way to look at it, because it overlooks all the key critical boundaries that will exist among those practices. But then, you know, then if you place yourself at the center of the universe the way I do in that slide, it's all right. So we're all in the center of the universe. It's just I didn't want to put your picture there, but I could have if I had it. That a lot of what we do is modulating how we identify with the world and how we find places of accountability, you know. And you can see that as the world complexifies, the process is becoming more complex. And for me, I can tell you, at any moment in my life, I could be investing myself in 200 places. You see what I mean? I'm constantly juggling, you know, who I am becoming. Because there are wine tasters who attract me, there are very good books by Bourdieu that I should have read, and there are, you know, there's a new business book on innovation that I should have read, and there's this new community there that says the way we are applying your theory, I think you would find it very interesting to belong, and so on and so forth. So a kind of implication of this theory, and it would be interesting then to see what are the implications for teaching, but an implication of this theory is that it would interpret the postmodern world, so-called postmodern world, or post-industrial world that we are entering, as a shift of the burden of identity from the collective to the person. And I think it's important to interpret what I just said properly. I am not saying that community is disappearing and that we are all becoming individuals. That is not at all what I'm saying. You know, if to sustain knowledge in this world, you need to belong to a community where only 10 people understand what you are saying, then community is not disappearing. You see what I mean? It's actually even more important than in the past, because you need to form a very specialized community to sustain this kind of knowledge ability. Okay? So we are not moving away from community to individuality. This is not what this theory would predict. But this theory would predict that because you interact with many, many communities, the burden of becoming a person is at the intersection between those communities, and therefore a more individual project. Because you cannot simply say, oh, I'm Swiss, And this gives me my identity. You see what I mean? You have to say, oh, I'm Swiss, but I live in California, and I'm married to a person from Kenya who lived in Portugal for a long time. And you know what I mean? It's like very in between, in that negotiation with where do we place our investment of who we are, you know, in all those things. Does it make any sense? And I think that from a pedagogical standpoint, see, a perspective that takes this seriously will have to move from focusing on a curriculum. This is the curriculum. These are the things we want to teach you. To a view of we need to sustain the construction of a productive person among these multiple choices, you know. And you know, I think it is controversial, but in the U.S., you know, for instance, the curriculum has become so full of stuff that there's no place for that. Like my son's complaint about high school is that high school is a place where you are not allowed to be interested in anything. Because if you become interested in something, you will fail in other subjects and you will not be able to move on to university. And I was thinking to myself, we have created an institution where at this most formative time, our kids are not allowed to be interested in anything. Nothing.
It doesn't get any better at university.
Well, yeah. I was just talking about this specific experience, you know. And I'm not saying that there should be no curriculum, or there should be no sense that all students there are certain things that all students need to know. But to me, the big learning issue that I face in my life is really an issue of where is it worth investing myself, you know. And we give no practice of that learning challenge to our students. I think that's a serious educational problem. So I think that also, if some of you are in education, taking a perspective like this would actually have pedagogical implications. What would that mean? Does it mean we do the free school of Summerhill? So, then what do you want to study this morning? What's your mood? Like, will that be what we need to do? Is there a discipline of identity? Oh, okay. So you're interested in rock guitar. Do you know what it takes to engage with the masters of this practice? Do you know the transformative concentration that you're going to have to do to one day engage with the masters of a practice? That's another thing that my kids have never seen in high school, is someone who is the master of a practice. And what does it take to engage with the master of a practice? In mathematics, they always see teachers who are not very good at mathematics, you know. So this notion of like the discipline of identity is an interesting one, because one of the aspects of a social discipline of learning would be, know the depth. Maybe this is why the kids who are in sports actually have a leg up on other kids, because they know what it takes to be very, very good at something. See? In school, you never have to be very, very good at anything. You just have to be good enough to have a good mark. But what about the transformative? Because somebody asked me, you know, I was talking about meaningfulness, you know, and they were saying, no, but aren't there dark aspects to learning, you know, like road aspect to learning, or there's a dark tunnel of learning, but the dark tunnel of learning is not meaninglessness, which is what many students experience as a dark tunnel of high school. The dark tunnel of learning is that, you know, if you want to become the best swimmer in the world, you're going to come. There's going to come a time where you say, no, I can't do this. I give up. You see what I mean? It's going to transform you as a person, you know. But that is true of any practice. If you want to become really, really good, if you want to interact with the master of that practice, it's going to have a transformative effect on you as a person. And breadth also. See, I'm saying, what is the social discipline of learning from that perspective? So, is it good for my cousin my cousin has experienced committing to a community where only 10 people understand. See what I mean? That's depth, right? Is it good for him to just do that? Should we encourage our students at age 14 to just do that? Well, no, it might be impoverishing. Actually, my cousin had to play the cello to remember that he was a human being, you know? So he was also a cellist. So breadth is important. Crossing boundaries is very important, you know? Why is it that we allow our students to finish high school without ever having crossed a serious boundary? Or maybe they have, but it's incidental, they do it outside of school. But the school never puts them in a context where their identity doesn't work, in a social context where you disintegrate, you know, and you learn how to record. Crossing boundaries of practice is going to be maybe the key to world peace, you know, this ability to engage with another, you know, a real another, you know. Yeah.
I'd say that is a lot of students expect, well, not a lot, but students will come into school and that will be the case. They will be crossing a boundary to get there and they will be disintegrating while they're there. So,
but not
in a positive way, obviously.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And in spite of the school, not because of the school, I think. Yeah. So there are cliques in the playground and so on and so forth where people have wrenching experiences. Yeah.
But also the culture of the school will conflict and the competence necessary will completely conflict with some people's home
Absolutely.
competencies.
Absolutely. Our competence is on the street, you know. This beautiful talk we had. Were you there when Julian Evans gave her talk? It was a beautiful community of practice perspective on a classroom, because people often ask me, so is a classroom a community of practice? And of course not. It's not. A classroom is just a piece of institutional design. It's not a community of practice. Now, there may be some community of practice happening there, but what she did was more like saying, what are the places of accountability? See, you can think of a practice as a place of accountability to a form of knowledgeability. So she looked at those kids, very much in the way you were saying, and she tells the story of a young boy who really wanted to learn how to read. He was viewed as learning disabled by the school. He wanted to learn how to read, but he was not going to learn how to read in a classroom with his peers from that street gang that he belonged. And so she had to teach him actually at home, you know, so that he could learn how to read without exposing his identity to the other places of accountability. So you're right? These sort of multiple demands, these multiple places of accountability where, you know, learning how to read was viewed as feminine in that other practice. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's a beautiful ethnographic study of a classroom by saying, where are there places of accountability that people carry into the classroom that conflict with the kind of accountability that the institution would like to impose or make attractive. Okay, so I think that's enough. But if you have a remark or a question, so these are the kind of this is the last time, at least I give a lecture in that course. The sessions in the course are discussions, okay, and discussion where we don't only look at this theory, we also look at activity theory. We also look at something that's called figured word theory. Those are cousins, really. You will see that they are very, very close to each other in what they're trying to do, but they take a somewhat different perspective. And so we explore that, and we explore that in conversation, and we explore that also in respect to the kind of work that you want to do. So part of the course is also to apply that to the kind of data that you are collecting for your own research, and see how that gives a different way to frame your research. So it's a very interactive, but it's also very applied in the sense that we want the theory to mean something to you as a researcher in terms of framing data. So maybe you want to talk a bit more about the course, who is going to be in it, and
questions. I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions or wants to have a discussion with Etienne.
Yeah.
Before.
Just ask, thinking it sort of works on identity and how much you're going to be able to maintain a productive identity.
Yeah.
Can you sort of points of relation with that strand of your theory with the activity systems theory, which I've been sort of delving around lately. It seems to be coming from quite a different place, more focused on a different sort of unit of analysis. What sort of
Join the course. This is what we discuss all the time. But for me, in a nutshell, activity theory is much more focused on the negotiation of objects and objectives in the world, right? So it's a cousin. It's really a cousin. For me, my emphasis is the person as constructing an identity of knowledgeability. Okay, I think the unit of analysis of activity theory is much more the negotiation of something to achieve, right? And how that happens in social context, and how that creates or doesn't create learning. You see what I mean? So the two they just look at the same processes from a somewhat different perspective, but of course the negotiation of our identity also takes place in the context of accountability that have not just to do with practice, but accountability that have to do with things to achieve, right? So these are different kinds of accountability. You see, the accountability to a practice is somewhat different from the accountability to a team that is trying to achieve something, or an institution that is trying to achieve something. You know, sometimes they are complementary. You know, if you're a good electrician, you know, then your accountability to being a good electrician is very aligned with the accountability of building that house. But if the person who wants to build that house say, I don't want to pay more than $20 for this piece of equipment, and your accountability to your practice is like, no, but if you do that, it's dangerous. My identity as a good electrician, but I need the job. See what I mean? So the accountability of an objective, and the accountability of how you maintain a sense of who you are as a learner, as a knowledgeable person, can be sometimes in harmony and can be sometimes in conflict.
I mean, I think that's a very good point, actually, at which to go to the second half of the meeting, where Suzanne's going to lead us in a discussion about how the course works. Because, as Etienne says, you know, we're often addressing questions just like that. Different theoretical positions. How do they work? Can they work together? Are they in conflict, etc., etc. But having given us such an interesting talk, I think maybe we should say thank you to Etienne before we move that part of the meeting.
Thank you. So if anyone isn't interested in the course, I don't know how that's possible after all that, but you can leave now. And really,
Yeah, another way. If you need to leave now, nobody will judge you.
No, we won't. Much. So I've got